we committed to a constitution far ahead and far better than Pakistan did. This is really not a blame game or a certification of the role of the armies, right? It's more about the factors that either enabled the army to usurp power in Pakistan or led to the army in India staying away from politics.
Today's guest is a scholar and a lawyer.
Mamata Banerjee would do well to listen to the protesting doctors. You cannot accuse everyone as having an agenda. That the army has no place in politics or in democratic governance except to the extent mandated by the law.
There was a character like Karyappa, this magnetic, war hero, much decorated, somebody who was famous already before the media itself was so powerful. Even then, his fame almost matched that of the political establishment of India.
There is not a single pointed incident or instance during Field Marshal Karyappa's regime or his tenure which ever points to him or his senior officers trying to be adventurous in any way politically.
What do you think is an ideal way for chiefs to be appointed, for the top brass to be appointed?
Up to the colonel rank, the appointments take place within the military, the army or the equivalent in the navy and the air force. But senior appointments, ironically, are more at the discretion of the government. Everyone, including the Supreme Court, said there is now a need for a reformed collegium. And you brought in standard operating procedures, etc. But that's not meant a new apparatus, a new constitutional apparatus.
In the judiciary also, you have political appointments and people who are overtly today communal and sectarian. In the army, the emergence of these kind of characters is, I started my career in Bangalore, coastal Karnataka, and I know for a fact that right-wing organizations over there by design train young people to enter the judiciary, to enter the military, to enter the police establishment.
Whether they're police officers or army officers, they come from society, and therefore your inbuilt religious, caste, societal, regional prejudices are bound to feed into your identity. Many times they're involuntary. But that said, there is something within the institution in which you serve which ought to prevail. The Punjabi, dominant Punjabi in Pakistan never saw the Bengali speaking East Pakistani as one of their own. It's as simple as that. And the outcomes were extreme. Bangladesh was in fact formed as a result of those differences which could never be bridged. Civilian leaders, both in the West and in the East or in Bangladesh, have somehow at the end of the day proven to be more autocratic. And that's something Sheikh Hasina is paying for today.
The most influential ism in the country today appears to be Hindutva. It has taken a long time for this ideology to come of age. But what happened to the other ideological movements that began in the early 20th century? The RSS will turn 100 years old next year, but so will the Communist Party of India. Ambedkarism, Marxism, liberalism, Dravidianism, feminism, Gandhiism. What role are these great big isms of the 20th century playing in the 21st century? What relevance do they have today?
Have a tree.
I'm an atheist in the same way as I'm an leprechaun.
Why have there been casteism existing in the country still today?
Feminism, by definition, is the belief that men and women should have equal
So the
rights.
nature of the system is to be as mean and rotten as you can, to try to maximize profit.
I'm Sudipto Mondal, and welcome to this episode of What's Your Ism? Hello and welcome to What's Your Ism? I'm Sudipto Mondal, and today's guest is a scholar and a lawyer, Aditya Sondhi, who is the former Additional Advocate General of Karnataka, and he's since, of course, relocated to Delhi, where he is a senior advocate practicing in the Supreme Court. the reason Aditya is here, of course, we're going to discuss his career and the other achievements in his life, but his latest achievement is this book. It's called Poles Apart. It's focused on India and Pakistan and how the armies of these two countries have, over the last, since independence, have acted in quite divergent ways, in very different ways. And Aditya Sondhi's book is an exploration of why that happened and why is it that India and its army managed to, stick with democracy, whereas in Pakistan, it just became a recurring phenomenon for military establishments to take control. Aditya, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on What's Your Ism.
Thank you, Sudipto. Thank you.
I'll get to your book, but I first, want to talk about something, that happened a few years ago. You would have perhaps taken the elevation as the judge of the Karnataka High Court. You were slated for elevation, and it didn't happen. Is that the reason? I mean, like in 2021 is when this whole controversy exploded, where you were slated to be elevated for, and then kept in a suspended animation state for almost a year, and then you withdrew your name from the race. And when I checked on you next, you were in Delhi. What happened? Is that the reason you left Bangalore? What happened?
Yeah, I was actually meant to move to Delhi some years ago to shift my practice, but then having consented to elevation, it was obviously thought fit to stay back in Bangalore and await that process. But as you're aware, after the collegium's recommendation and reiteration, the government continued to sit on my file, at which point I withdrew my consent. And you're right, thereafter, the logical sort of next step was to shift to Delhi, and that happened began in 2022. It took me a while to make the transition, but I think 2023 is when I was able to fully relocate here.
All right. And I want to talk a little about, before we get into the book, which I'm excited to do, this whole episode, which we know very little about. We really don't know why somebody like an Aditya Sondhi didn't get elevated. And that, once again, in the circles in Bangalore, raised the questions about the opacity, the kind of, this smoke and mirror system, which, leads to people's elevation, the collegium system. What is your view on the collegium system? It's always in conversation.
I've in fact spoken to the News Minute about this after I withdrew my consent, where I shared whatever information was available with me. As to the reasons, only the government can answer. We are not privy to those reasons. The collegium process itself, I think, was well intended, because it was meant to distance the executive from the process of judicial appointments. But in the manner it has worked historically, I think one has seen, as I came to realize myself, that the last word is still always with the government. And therefore, despite this superstructure of a collegium, which is, by the way, not mentioned in the Constitution, it's developed through judgments of the Supreme Court. But this superstructure, which was meant to sort of separate the executive's interference, only worked up to a point, which is probably to the extent of the recommending process. But when it comes to the sort of the final sign-off, de facto, the government continues to hold sway on these decisions. And there are different ways in which that is done, either by returning files or simply postponing them. Right? So you're right. In that sense, it's not very transparent. Things seem to work at their own pace. In some cases, appointments can happen overnight. In other cases, they take their own sweet time. I know of a couple of colleagues who, in fact, waited over 2.5, 3 years even for their appointment. Some are still waiting. Whereas, and you know what that means, right? That means 3 years of seniority, 3 years of limbo, right? 3 years of frustration. And in the interregnum, you will find appointments taking place at breakneck speed when the government so desires. So I think had the collegium system worked in complete spirit, it would have worked well. But now we have this hybrid which prevails.
Right. So you'd rather... So because the reason I ask you this is because there's this very strong not entirely outlandish criticism of the collegium system as something which is almost undemocratic. And the argument comes from the fact that the political establishment should have a say in the appointment of judges. It happens in different countries that judges are political appointees, and that in a way keeps the civil administration in control, of the judiciary. And please answer this, this criticism if you can. And the reason I also ask it is because the similar questions come in the context of the army as well, in the appointment of chiefs and the top brass of the army. Who gets to select them? So we'll talk about that when we talk about it. But right now, in this collegium system, people saying that it's a democratic thing for the political establishment to be part of this decision making. How do you respond to that?
Look, you use the word control on appointments. I don't think the executive or the government should have control in appointments. Should it have a say? Of course it should, and it does. Even the collegium
But
process,
via media, right?
Even the
It has via media say. Might as well make it direct and do away with the collegium system.
Not do away, improve the system by probably moving towards a fresh constitutional body like you have, say, in South Africa, which is well represented by judges, by jurists, by civil society, and by the government as well. I think that is an ideal. And not only is it diverse in terms of composition, it also has very transparent systems in which it works. It has an apparatus, it has an infrastructure, so it's autonomous in that sense. And of course, there's no doubt that's an ideal where everyone has an official involvement in the process. But please don't be under the impression that the collegium system ousts the government. If the government is involved at every stage, you get clearance from the state government, from the IB, you get clearance from the central government, and ultimately, as I said, the sign-off is again by the government itself. So it's involved, but you're right in that it should be, I think, in a more linear way. It should be more well-known to everyone. People should know where they stand. There should be time frames involved as well, especially when council consent. They ought to know where they stand in the system. So there's no doubt we need to move towards an improved system. And I think that's where we can look at the South African model as, I think that comes fairly close to an ideal system. And that would require then necessarily a constitutional amendment, something the government attempted with the NJAC, but it was so lopsided in favor of the government and dangerous to the idea of judicial independence that it ultimately got struck down.
Right. Now, the judiciary, it is, is imagined as this collection of dispassionate judges, judges who do not have strong, let's say, political ideologies. People who have when they talk about a clean track record, it's not merely about the quality of judgments that they have left behind. It's not only about whether they're corrupt or not. There's an IB report, like you mentioned. It talks about. It looks into many aspects of a judge's life. Also, this thing of what her or his political predilections are. Now, the grapevine around your elevation, or the fact that you were put on hold, is that some sections in the government saw you as political, because of your association in matters concerning, let's say, human rights. You have a Twitter persona as well, that is not something that you see most judges doing, a few now, perhaps some of the new age judges, Chandrachud being the most prominent of them. Do you think that, you were seen as a politically active person, or a person with some isms that were not palatable for the judiciary? What happened there?
I in fact thought we were going to be talking about my book, but I'll answer this anyway.
Okay, no, this is the last question.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay.
No, in fact,
I know it makes you a little uncomfortable being in the judiciary speaking about these things.
I'm not. I
just want to know.
In the judiciary, I withdrew my consent.
I'm
a humble practicing lawyer.
As a lawyer,
yeah. No. If anything, I think political affiliations fast track your chances at elevation. That's very clear now. So I've been apolitical all my life, in the sense that I have obviously a political perspective on things, My book is an outcome
Yeah.
of my PhD on political theory and political science. So, in that sense, I'm deeply political, but I'm not political in terms of an affiliation to any party, and nor are my views or ideologies driven by any of those affiliations. So, I don't think I was seen as political. Perhaps I may have been seen as independent in my thought. Obviously, not related to Twitter. I got on Twitter, in fact, after I withdrew my consent, but
Right.
perhaps having an opinion on matters of human rights, as you said, on the CAA, on matters of constitutional propriety, constitutionalism, and so on, may have sent. You see, these are not matters known to us, as I already mentioned to you.
Mhm.
Nobody communicates this to you. As far as I am concerned, the procedure entails the collegium's clearance of your suitability. And the collegium of the Supreme Court, beginning with the collegium of the High Court, by the way, goes up to the collegium of the Supreme Court, not once but twice, thought it fit to recommend and reiterate my name. Uh, After being fully aware of the work I do, which is really, it's not political, I repeat. It is in keeping with my role as an advocate serving the Constitution. Now, beyond that, which part of it makes somebody uncomfortable, I really can't speculate on. And in fact, this is the part that I tried to mention earlier, that council should know where they stand. And it should not be a message to young counsel that if you're doing some amount of human rights work, you're taking on the government in matters, that will come in your way. Because if that is the messaging, then a lot of competent lawyers are going to step back. And if they step back, then your pool of selection is getting thinner. You're getting a certain type of judge alone. You're only then getting judges who are either government advocates or they are counsel who are playing safe. That's fine. That pool will also provide good judges, no doubt. But you must necessarily also then draw from this remaining pool of those who are willing to, argue matters of civil rights, of constitutional issues, and not necessarily toe the government's line.
Thanks for engaging with that question, and sorry for pushing you in that direction. I hope it didn't set you off. Okay, now the thing is, Sondhi, the last thing I want to talk about before I want to get into the book is your association with Bangalore. I was a reporter starting off. You were a young lawyer, and we used to come to you, to understand so many of these cases that you were dealing with, these human rights cases that we speak of. That's not my question. My question to you is: you come from a refugee family, a post-partition family from Quetta. I kind of was talking about how I feel the sense of solidarity with you because my family also goes back to Mirpur in Bangladesh, and both our families found a home in a city like Bangalore. What did this city do for you? You think, or your family? Coming as it did, carrying as it did the trauma of partition, a city like Bangalore, which is very, very distant from those realities of the border. What was it like for your family and for yourself growing up here?
Yeah, great question. I mean, for me, look, Bangalore has defined who I am. There's no two ways about it. My identity, that certain sort of free secular spirit, that syncretic spirit with which you grow up, a very cosmopolitan, diverse spirit. My schooling has largely, defined what my priorities and my character are. In that sense, despite my move, my attachment with Bangalore is very deep. As far as my family is concerned, look, they were the ones who had the lived experience of partition. My father was young. He didn't move directly to Bangalore, incidentally. He moved to Shimla. And he was there till he completed his schooling in early college. And then, being a sort of an entrepreneur by spirit, he moved to Bangalore and set up his business and so on. But from everything I know and I've heard, my dad always loved Bangalore for what it was, a welcoming, non judgmental space. And we go on about Bangalore being an IT city and
Yeah.
nurturing IT and so on. It's actually been nurturing startups from my dad's generation. Maybe not IT, but he set up one of Bangalore's best known nightclubs. at a time, when there were very few of them there. So in that sense, Bangalore was very cosmopolitan and cantonment town and very welcoming in that sense. And all of the partition families in Bangalore, and maybe you'll agree with me, actually don't even carry that weight of partition really. Bangalore has welcomed and integrated us so well that I've never heard a complaint or a story about trauma, really. Honestly, my dad's only always had the best things to say. Beyond that, my grandparents, of course, belong to different parts of the country. My mother's side was in Delhi, incidentally. They moved to Bangalore later. My maternal grandparents retired to Bangalore. My dad's folks moved to Bangalore towards, the evening of their life. But in terms of a direct connection, as far as my dad's concerned, I think he consciously chose Bangalore, right? It was not an accident for someone from Shimla to move all the way here, right? It was obviously a conscious choice, and that speaks volumes for the city we grew up in.
Right. Now, I don't know if I'm taking a long shot over here because your book is about the militaries of India and Pakistan, and Bangalore is a cantonment city, where a lot of the culture, was a result of the fact that there was this huge cosmopolitan military presence, and a lot of its, social and cultural institutions were also like spawned by the presence of the military over here. So, I wonder if you'll agree with that.
I would, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, now coming to this this fantastic book you've put together, I must congratulate you. I'm sorry I couldn't finish the entire thing. There's a chapter on Bangladesh, which I haven't yet read. But the book is divided into, let's say, 2.5 sections, which is there's a entire section on India, followed by a section on Pakistan, and there's a small section on Bangladesh. Now, my first question to you is, how we'll get into the specifics, but just give our audience a sense of this stark difference between the Pakistan and Indian armies. What is it in your book that you bring out to show how India actually never even came close to ever experiencing a coup? Your initial thoughts and comments, and then I'm going to get into specifics and probably sections in the book and deal with it in detail.
Yeah, so if I was to really put my finger on one thing here, and this is important, is that we committed to a constitution far ahead and far better than Pakistan did. This is really not a blame game or a certification of the role of the armies, right? It's more about the factors that either enabled the army to usurp power in Pakistan or led to the army in India staying away from politics. And of course, those factors relate to the ethos of the military itself. But as we're fully aware, the early upbringing and ethos of officers on both sides was the same.
Yeah.
They grew up together, they served together, they fought
Sandhurst.
together. Yeah, they went to the same institution. So I don't think there's any difference in that sense. But things changed really because of the circumstances in which the army in Pakistan came into the fold. And it really was brought in due to the absence of an elected government, the absence of a police force that could deal with sectarian violence in Pakistan, and on the back of an executive that was serving under the umbrella of the Government of India Act of 1935. And, in a longer shot of history, sometimes these things get forgotten. But at that point in time, it's crucially important to recognize that we already had a constitution in place. We had elections. And however, we had the same difficulties in many ways in sort of this experiment with a new country. And ours was a bigger and I think a more complex experiment than Pakistan. But that space was there. That structure was there. And I would say to the credit of the army that it enabled that space. As I argue in my book, and we can get into that later, there were occasions when the army could have done otherwise. And Pakistan would certainly have seen that happen because of the traditions it had inherited. But the one key factor for me, and maybe that's my bias as a lawyer and a constitutionalist, is the fact that we had quickly committed to these structures. And therefore, not only our our progression as a country was to be on those lines, but any course correction that was needed was also to be found within those constitutional means and could never be left to extra constitutional forces, pun intended, like the armed forces, to step in and run the government for you, right? And I think that to me is the central point.
Right, and that point does of course come through, and it comes up recurring as a recurring theme in your book. The strength of the institutions, the fact perhaps that the Indian Army is by design beholden to the government as opposed to the Pakistan Army, which Jinnah held. Or which is at Jinnah's instruction was beholden to the constitution of Pakistan and not to the government of Pakistan, which left it open to interpretation, which means that the army could take an interpretation of the constitution, take a stand based on that interpretation. Now, I understand these institutional safeguards that you speak of in India, but a lot of the details in your book also give you a little bit of a fright, saying that was it really institutions or was it providence? And you say this yourself in the conclusion of your section on India. You say, let me see, where is this? The political shortcomings and other scenarios discussed in the preceding chapters could well have triggered a more interventionist approach by the military. But mercifully, this is the important word I think over here, but mercifully, the armed forces abstained from crossing any lines in the sand. So there's a little bit of mercy involved in addition to these institutions that you speak of, right? Some providence?
There is, in the sense, and I think that's where probably the discipline and the ethos of the armed forces needs to be recognized and respected. Because at these crucial points, it's not an everyday scenario that a general is required to take a stand and either interpret or acknowledge where the command is coming from. But in those crises moments, especially, for example, during the emergency, right, it could be argued that generals were entitled to take a view of that legitimacy. And once they took a view of it, is where the cracks begin to occur. And what if then the armed forces felt that that emergency was unlawful? Then who's going to be the final arbiter? But fortunately, and that's probably a different element of the merciful point I make, that we had reached a stage where institutionally, the pecking order was very clear, that the constitution enabled an emergency to be imposed. If it had to be held unconstitutional, it was not the army's business to decide it, but that of the Supreme Court. If the Supreme Court upheld it, you obeyed it. If the Supreme Court struck it down, you obeyed that. So in that sense, I think that the line of command, if you will, is more straightforward and clear in the Indian instance. In Pakistan, the difficulty is, it's not just a matter of interpretation, it's also a matter of the absence of a single source of power. Their constitution came late in 56, by which time you already had martial law, which I think in some ways was a fait accompli. Coupled to that is the fact...
Their first elections were held in 1970, proper elections.
Precisely. And that crucial early period of 10-15 years is, I think, make or break for young countries. And invariably, that's where strong arm institutions like the army come in and they decide. And that, that's a very whimsical way. And I've read in multiple places generals commenting on how they know best and they ought to, safeguard